All right, guys. Kara, Tomicah, and Sheila are three of the smartest people that we could have right now talking about policy. There is so much to talk about when it comes to policy. I think we have 30 minutes. We could probably go 2 hours on it. We won't. But, you know, suffice to say, we've been doing some other interviews this morning, and everyone brings this up. Everyone says this is maybe the most important thing for this whole industry right now. I'll start with a little anecdote. I don't know how many people in the room were at Mainnet 1 year ago. Raise your hand. Were you here a year ago? I don't know if you read news following the event. Someone actually got served by the SEC at Mainnet 1 year ago. Got handed a subpoena at the event. And in the years since then, I don't think you could say that the regulatory and policy environment has improved. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's room for optimism. But there's a lot of rhetoric coming from the regulators about which tokens look like securities, what we should do for this industry to protect consumers. Kara, let's start with you from the Coinbase perspective. And the best thing, guys, all three of these people have totally different perspectives because of where they work. But for you guys, I mean, you have to be very buttoned up. You have to try and be friendly with regulators, play nice. But when you look at what's coming out, some of the things being said, you know, 2 days ago, the SEC basically saying that it thinks all Ethereum transactions are US transactions. How do you proceed and try and spur positive change with policy?
Well, first, because I'm buttoned up, I always wear a suit, so everybody knows where I'm coming from. You know, I think that there is room for optimism, and I think the way we approach it right now is thinking about how crypto has permeated the American psyche and the American economy, really. And so when we start with that message that this matters to policymakers because their constituents care about it, that gets us in the door. I think with regulators, it's a challenge because they're there to regulate. So they see everything through the lens, we were just talking about this, kind of through the lens of history, rather than what blockchain and crypto can do and how it can change markets, expectations, consumer beliefs. So that's, I think, some of the barriers we're trying to get at. But I do think that there's room for optimism, primarily because of the pressure coming from Congress. I think that they, for the first time, are actively engaging and working towards some solutions and going beyond, I think, just the regulator viewpoint and actually trying to think more creatively about this. That, to me, is the kind of the bright shining star right now.
Sheila, let's get the view from the lobbyist, fair to say? Is that the right word? I mean,
I'm not a
when
lobbyist,
but when we're pushing for change.
Yeah. So Crypto Council, so Coinbase is a member, and we are a global alliance. So we're looking at policy around the world. And so I do think, Dan, if you're looking narrowly at the one agency you're citing, which is the SEC, yes, I do think we've seen increasing rhetoric that I do think is cause for some concern and increasing actions. This regulation by enforcement that we all talk about as being not the correct path to a solid regulatory foundation or policy foundation. However, you know, we're in a global economy, and crypto is global. It's borderless. And so what has been encouraging is seeing comprehensive frameworks come down in Europe. That's MiCA, which the Markets in Crypto Act is about to land, the final language there. And there was a lot of recognition of what is perhaps ready for regulation or more ready, and what is not at all ready for regulation, which was very promising, the understanding that crypto is not a monolith. The other thing I'll say is last night in Washington, the Crypto Council held our first annual Digital Future Award, and we used objective criteria, and we were able to establish that there were almost 30 congresspeople who had taken some positive action that supported the crypto ecosystem. That is a really big deal, because I can tell you a year ago, 2 years ago, that number would have been like 1.5, like 1.25, you know, maybe. And the fact that there were almost 30, now of course there's 535 of them, so let's calibrate that. Nevertheless, that is a pretty amazing set of dance partners they can all look to. And we're really seeing also, in another kind of very positive, optimistic note, this is a nonpartisan issue. We are seeing allies from across the political spectrum recognize the value of crypto, the importance of crypto, that crypto is not going anywhere, and that it's important to land this innovation in the United States. So we feel very optimistic at the Council, and I think you heard this from Kristen and Miller, I know as well, at DeFi Education Fund, that we're feeling like the progress that's coming, the conversations we're having are so much more productive than they used to be, because even if people don't really understand crypto and Web3, they know that they need to know. And so getting in the door is no longer a challenge. It's kind of answering the questions and bringing the right folks to the table to make sure that we're conveying the right message, and we're conveying a unified message as much as we possibly can.
Tomicah, let's get the venture perspective from Haun Ventures.
Well, I think we are in a really critical moment for a variety of reasons. It is incredibly consequential that when Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, last Friday, rolled out the report, which was not a great report on the EO, he said, we want to ensure that this industry stays in the United States and that the United States leads the world in digital assets. That is the view from the White House right now. That was not the view from the White House a year ago. So we have a profound shift at the very top of the executive branch in that people recognize the opportunity that exists in this space. That's not to say there isn't an enormous amount of work left to be done. There is, but we're in a very different place now. And to follow up on Kara's comments earlier, Congress is what is going to get us into a new era for this technology ecosystem. We have come about as far as we can using the very antiquated, very clunky 1930s and 40s era regulations that we have been operating within up to this point. But the change that's happening right now is that rather than just worrying about how to stay out of trouble, which is has been the primary focus of folks in the ecosystem up until now, we're now actually focused on how to shape a new policy architecture that is going to be fit for purpose in the 21st century. And that is a game changer.
That's very well put, not just trying to avoid getting in trouble, but actually positivity. Sheila, I'm really glad you mentioned the global perspective, because I'm probably erring very much on the US side here, but that is what everyone kind of sees. The Gensler comments get out there, but we talk about, someone mentioned to me, oh, we're working on a Bitcoin spot ETF. I said, good luck, because we don't have it in the US and we're waiting. We got the futures ETF. But I guess what I'd ask is there any indication that the more, I don't want to say lax, but the more allowing and open crypto policy outside the US will influence the US? Because as you say, Tomicah, the U.S., that was a positive indicator. We want the U.S. to be leading in crypto innovation. It isn't right now. But do you think they're taking a page from the other places? Or, you talk about a CBDC, they're watching what China's doing. I don't know if that leads to a positive landscape or not.
Yeah, so it's complicated, as it always is. And so I certainly wouldn't say that, I don't know that we'd ever use the word lax and regulation in the same place, because the very existence of regulation implies there's not really full laxity. Nevertheless, I do think some jurisdictions that are very, very crypto open and friendly are not really the ones the US is looking to as models, just being really honest. However, I do think that the advent of comprehensive kinds of frameworks in Europe, for example, even in Singapore with their unified authority, that is really spurring action here. And there are several leaders, I think, in the United States Congress and in the White House who understand that we are going to lose ground, and we're already starting to lose ground. So there's a pressure that's coming from there. Now, I don't know, I wouldn't say that apart from China in the CBDC frame, I wouldn't say that that's necessarily contagious to the US, right? The way that US policy will be contagious to many jurisdictions. We know that's the case. I wouldn't necessarily say it's coming down, but I do think as we see MiCA in Europe start to get implemented, what actually rolls out in terms of specific rules is going to be very instructive, because the easy path is for the US to follow what happens there. Now, that could go well or badly. That's why we're focusing a lot of our attention on Europe in the fall coming into 2023.
Yeah, for Coinbase's perspective, it's US-based. Well, now you say we don't have any headquarters. we're truly decentralized.
We're decentralized. We're all remote.
But a US company, and when you look at what's happening abroad, how can we square those things away? The USDC part of this is interesting because it feels like most recently what politicians have discovered is stablecoins. And they've locked in on stablecoins as both kind of the good and the evil, Terra collapse aside. They say, ooh, well, what if we have banks issue their own stablecoins? And some of these things, I mentioned CBDC, a central bank, a Fed coin. Some of these things, the true crypto people say, well, what is the point of that? That's not crypto,
Yeah, in terms of the global and the U.S. landscape, everybody's asking the same questions. Every regulator is asking the same questions, and stablecoins is one of those questions that everybody in every geo is thinking about. And at Coinbase, we've asked for a regulatory framework really since we were founded in 2012. We've been talking about how crypto needs slightly different rules to basically account for the lack of intermediaries and the lack of necessarily some traditional finance, firms, including some banks. That doesn't always go over well when we say that banks might be disintermediated. So we'll put a pin in that one. But I think the issue here is that there are so many different geographies that are trying to think about how to deal with this, and USDC along with all the other stable coins, I think will be one of the things that folks look to regulate more quickly because they can get their head around it. They can get their head around that something is one-to-one pegged to the US dollar, that it's used for a payment, that it looks more like a digital dollar, and you can actually use that, and how do we regulate that? And again, it goes back to this historical viewpoint of regulation. How do we put a square peg in a round hole? Stablecoins gets as close as you can get.
They can wrap their minds around something that's pegged to the dollar, except for when it loses its peg.
Right, exactly.
And it's
right.
way below a dollar.
Right. Let's not talk algos and crypto back aside. I think that's where we're still seeing a bit of fall off in understanding.
Tomicah, let's talk a little bit more about how you think the different companies and projects and platforms in the space are navigating this. We were just interviewing over in the Decrypt booth the guy from Library, which has been dealing with the SEC for 5 years. And someone alluded, I think Kristen Smith just now alluded to the Ripple SEC fight. Brad Garlinghouse is going to speak later. Everyone's kind of navigating it in their own way. But from your side of things, actually putting money into companies and investing and spreading your bets, is that one of the biggest hurdles right now? Is you think, gosh, we believe in this company or project, we believe in this founder, but then what if certain people decide it's a security?
Well, we certainly spend a lot of time during our review process determining whether founders have a policy roadmap. And it's not that that roadmap needs to be perfectly mapped out. We recognize that inevitably there are going to be some known unknowns along the way, but they need to be thinking about these questions. To the extent that founders are thinking about these questions, we're finding a lot of opportunity to build incredibly valuable, incredibly consequential projects. So it's not to say that these are hard hurdles that are going to be impossible to overcome. We just need a level of sophistication in a project to recognize these are issues that are going to need to be managed along the way. And if you go into it with the right mindset, there are a lot of good people at Haun Ventures, there are a lot of good people in the ecosystem who will help you get where you need to go.
Does the topic of policy or regulation or regulation by enforcement come up on calls now when you're exploring either
Absolutely.
With portfolio companies?
It is part of our formal review process in a way that it probably isn't for most other VCs, but we see that as a real differentiator and a big advantage. And what it means is that the folks that we partner with have a pretty high degree of confidence that we're going to be able to get where we need to go on that front.
Sheila, a lot of the job, I think we talked about this backstage quickly, but a lot of the job when we're talking about going to DC, having people on the board, having companies that are members and trying to kind of advocate for the industry is education. I mean, for years, and I think it's gotten maybe a little better, but for years you would see politicians say something, and it's like, wait a minute, they don't understand this technology. How can they begin to regulate when they don't understand how the tech works? Do you still feel that way? Has it gotten better in the last few years? I mean, that you kind of need to say, I remember Mark Zuckerberg said this at some point years ago when Facebook was facing regulatory issues. It was like, ooh, let us help you regulate us. First we need to teach you about what it is we do. We sell ads, sir. But, do you guys feel like you need to say, well, here's what DeFi is. Here's how these things actually work and what a protocol is. Then you can think about regulating it.
Yeah, it's a dance, right? Because you have to meet everyone where they are. And so now I think we have extraordinarily high variance in the level of accurate information, because there's inaccurate information that's very tightly held as gospel, which is not true. So unwinding some of that is more complicated. But like I said, in many cases, people are very open to learning, and I find a lot of humility. If you approach people and just kind of, you're open to expressing like what is it they want to know, and who do you bring to the table, who do we bring into meetings is very structured. Is it a technical person? Is it a policy person? Is it a lawyer? It varies depending on who we're talking to. One thing that's been really challenging, though, Dan, is that we've seen a lot of, and this is exciting on the one hand, there's pros and cons, right? We've seen a lot of people actually leaving government for the industry. And what that means is that there's more knowledge in the industry about how government works and operates as some of these amazing policy teams get built. However, there are gaps in the government. And so now we have to re-educate a lot of folks who we spent a lot of time, getting familiar with this technology. And the great news is they got so excited they wanted to join us. However, we now have to educate their counterparts and whoever takes that position. And we're dealing with this right now, actually, in some key offices. But I do feel that, generally speaking, we don't try to go in saying you need to become a technical master. We kind of say you need to understand what is this for, How does it differ, and why is it hard to regulate? That's the key, right? Why? Because if it were easy, it would already be regulated. And the things that are easier are the things that are more active discussions right now. But some of this stuff is really, really hard because it's really new. We haven't seen a digital asset and the kind of forms it can take before. So we don't know where to place it. And so that is something we try to be very honest about and explain why that is the case. And that, again, involves some element of governance discussion, some element of legal discussion and jurisprudence and precedent, and some discussion of technology as well.
Something all three of you keep circling and mentioning is history and the idea that this needs a new framework. That seems to be the hardest thing here. I mean, we talk about the Howey test. I don't need to redefine it for everyone, but it involves a citrus farm, and it's from the 1940s. And so maybe, is that the right year? I'm sure you know the year off the top of your head. It's like
1946.
Okay, thank you. The Howey test from 1946. I mean, so we're approaching regulation of a very new, yes, Bitcoin 13 years, but in the big scheme of things, very new technology, and we're applying something from 1946. How confident are you guys that we're actually going to get a new framework? Or are we already starting to capitulate in the sense of, well, can we just get a little more of what we want and improve on the fact that they're applying a almost 100-year-old framework?
If I can jump in on this, Dan, we've seen this movie before. So if you go back to the late 90s and the first generation of Web 1, at that point, the FCC was very adamant that every new web page should have to register using a process that was designed for ham radios. And they decided, we've got this framework, it's a good framework, it's been around for a long time, let's use that. Needless to say, we would be living in a very different world had the FCC gotten its way and forced every new web page on the internet to go through a process that was designed for ham radio operators. So we kind of know what this process entails. Fortunately, we seem to be arriving at a moment, to Kara's comment earlier, when wiser heads in Congress and in the executive branch are recognizing these are some fundamentally new tools. We're going to need some fundamentally new rules. That's going to take time. It's not going to be pretty. It's not going to be easy. There will be many steps back as we progress forward. But that core realization is starting to sink in. And once that sinks in, you're able to unlock vast opportunity.
And I think when it comes to a new framework, we, at Coinbase, we don't list securities on our platform. So we Bitcoin, Ethereum, and about 216 additional assets. And again, we don't think that those fit under the SEC jurisdiction. And so when we think about the CFTC or another regulator, we actually do think, and this is what Congress is working on right now, is actually building a framework for where that gap in the federal regulatory framework. We're regulated by a lot of regulators, a bunch of states. We got a lot of regulation. But this would address a federal gap. And I think what we're also seeing is that in the instances where historical rules may be applied, when we look at some of the SEC rules, we released a petition that asked 50 questions saying, this is where this doesn't work. This is how the old rules don't work. So I think when we get to really substantive analysis, we're hopeful that shining a bright light on where the rules don't work, we can actually get to better solutions and massage those. And then with the new framework, we can build that where we need to, whether that's, again, for stable coins or for commodities, or we have other assets out there. We're not even getting into NFTs, right? And some of those other assets. So
yeah. Something else that's really interesting is to Tomicah's example, we have a precedent, we have kind of a norm in the United States that we don't regulate technology. We let technology be, and we regulate activity that technology is enabling, right? It's complicated here because not everyone understands, by which I mean regulators and policymakers, what is the technology and what is not the technology, right? And we're not even consistent, frankly. I'm just going to look at all of us in the room. We're not even consistent about articulating that ourselves. We haven't done ourselves a lot of favors. And so part of what we're trying to frame out is, here is the stuff that needs to be left alone, to operate. And then here is this other stuff that's happening using that foundation, right? And those are different things. So there's just a fundamental, I think, encroachment in some of the precedents, to your point, the norm precedents that we have that I think we're finding the most troubling, and that's something we're pushing back really hard against when we see that. But again, the more alignment we have on what is tech and what is not tech as an industry, the better off we all are, because again, so many of us are privileged to be in this position of being able to have these conversations with the folks who are ultimately going to make the decisions about what happens to our industry in the United States.
And then anytime that the tech involves money and people potentially investing and potentially losing their shirts, I mean, that's the real issue is there's the tech, but then it's being used for finance. It's really interesting, Kara, you said, well, we don't list securities. Now, of course, you guys saying it doesn't necessarily mean that the folks who point and say these 9 are securities, they don't go, oh, well, they said they don't list securities, so we were wrong, they're not securities. I mean, that's the issue right now. There's a disagreement. Do you guys feel like you're getting an open door and that there is communication? A while back, maybe it was only a week or two ago, but Gary Genzer wrote an op-ed and said, I say to crypto projects, come to us, talk to us. And I think Ryan Selkis, from Messari tweeted and said, how? Or maybe it was Mark Cuban. How are we supposed to talk to you? Do you find that there's communication happening and that there's someone you can call and say, look, let's talk through this?
I think communication is happening. The challenge is that there are, what we've called for is an open and transparent process, a rulemaking process where they would actually go through and develop an industry-wide solution set for these issues. And so while every individual company under the sun, every company here can go in and talk to the SEC or to the other regulators, it doesn't mean that they're doing something in a transparent way where we can actually have clear rules of the road for everybody. Coinbase can go in, but the next innovator or the next builder or the next project manager, they still have that uncertainty that you have to deal with. And so we really want to get to a whole of industry solution. And so while we will continue to talk, we always talk to our regulators. We have dormant broker-dealer licenses. We have a DCM with a CFT. We have an FCM application. So we talk to our regulators all the time. But really, we need a transparent process that will get us to a solution, not one-off conversations or one-off enforcement actions.
Can you pick up the phone and reach someone at the CFTC, the SEC, the IRS?
Sure, absolutely.
You feel that way too, Sheila?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's not everyone understands what that access point is, right? I think there are folks who've engaged with these agencies before. Some of it is relationships and contacts and things like that. The hotline doesn't always get you where you need to go, like in any context, right? Dial the number, you might be on hold for a while.
I'll just wait on hold, yeah.
Yeah, just exactly, like nice music, perhaps. But I do feel that and again, the experience will differ, right? I think that's important to understand as well. If you're coming in as a brand new player, there's going to be a different experience you're going to have. And if you're a very well-established player, who's kind of you've got robust market participation, you've got diversity of participants, like that kind of thing, right? It's not the same. I don't think it's monolithic. And that's, I think, to Kara's point, like it is not a whole of industry approach right now. It's quite custom. But the avenues are there, and the communication is definitely happening. It's just maybe a little bit less streamlined than we would like.
I'm hearing a lot of optimism on this panel, which is great. I hope everyone in the room is sensing that. Tomicah, start us off with what we promised we would do on this panel, which is the crystal ball. So I've grilled you guys on the current situation. There's some upsetting things, there's some optimism. Let's look 3-5 years down the road. What does policy in the US, and maybe not just the US, but we're here in the States, look like for everyone in crypto? And does it look like a space that is chilling innovation or encouraging and welcoming it?
Well, let me do this. I'm gonna paint a wildly optimistic picture, and then I'm going to tell you the things that need to happen in order to realize that wildly optimistic picture. If we get this right, we will open up a new generation of the internet, and we will see the merger of financial architecture and infrastructure with digital architecture and infrastructure in a way that is going to be profoundly exciting and consequential, not just for our industry, but for all of humanity. This will unleash a truly new renaissance of creativity, as many of the tools and instruments that have previously been reserved for a very small handful of institutions and individuals suddenly become democratized and are in the hands of far more human beings. So that's really cool.
Sounds amazing.
In order to pull that off, we're going to have to do a couple of things, and these will not be easy. So I want to stipulate at the outset, as a community, we're going to have to embrace some work that is going to be tough. The first is we need to think really hard about the macro level narratives that we are using. We need to present solutions to problems that policymakers care about, rather than just asking them to solve our problems. We're going to have to put forward solutions to problems that everyday citizens care about, rather than just asking folks to care about this stuff, because we know about it and we think it's really, really cool. And it is, in fairness, really, really cool. But we need to get better at telling the story of the technology that we want to support. The same thing, along those same lines, we will probably need to think hard about the vocabulary that we are using to tell that story.
Yep.
We are fortunate to work in an ecosystem with incredibly, incredibly brilliant people who spend lots of time researching super technical, super detailed constructs and complexes so that we don't have to deal with those all day ourselves. We are missing a lot right now and losing a lot in the translation of those ideas to broader audiences, and we're going to have to get much smarter about the way we do that. If we solve for those things, if we solve real problems, if we tell compelling stories that address the challenges that people and policymakers face in their regular lives, and if we use the right words to tell those stories, which we're not doing right now, frankly, we're going to unlock that future, and man, is that worth it. But we're going to have to make some changes ourselves to pull that off.
A lot of jargon. That's what we try and do at Decrypt, is educate and help people understand. But it's hard. It's a very opaque space. Sheila, crystal ball.
I couldn't agree with that more. I mean, I would put it even more bluntly. You know, I think that the industry needs to start aligning and recognizing that there is not a world in which we're going to operate forever without regulation and policy. It's just not a real world, and so it's time to accept that reality and recognize that either we are working together collaboratively with policymakers or providing them with the evidence that they really are asking for, frankly. They're very open to evidence, not all of them, but most of them, many of them, are very open to evidence of like, how is this new, what makes it so exciting, what is it solving, what are the real problems that it's engaging with, like, all of that's really important. And I'll add one other thing to your meta-narrative concept, which you know I totally agree with, which is I think our vocabulary is a hot mess. But we also have to be moving away from just telling stories about financial services. There's a lot more to this than just, and when we cling to that narrative and all we talk about is tokens and prices and things like that, we get pushed into financial regulation, which is some of the most prescriptive regulation that exists in the entire world, no matter
so
where you are.
Right here.
Singapore, the United States, the UK, I don't care where you are, Switzerland, it doesn't matter, even Malta. Like, those are prescribed rules for a reason. What we're building is a lot bigger than just financial services. So those stories have to start getting surfaced. And if we don't do that, we're going to wind up in a world where, yes, the SEC is going to take over a ton of jurisdiction because we're teeing that up. We're teeing it up to the way that we talk about and represent our critical, innovative work. So +1 to everything that you just said. I am extremely optimistic. That's why I took this job in the first place. So I feel very confident, but I also know we are in a critical time. Like 3 to 5 years from now, we're going to, a lot of this, like, there may not be, like this won't be a main stage panel. It might be something that's like on a side stage because it's like, oh, what tweaks are going to happen in the thing? You know, the main work is happening right now. So buy your favorite policy person a drink. We all need it. And strap in. It's going to be a very bumpy ride, but I'm confident we're going to get there if we all go together.
I think there will be 3 things, and I agreed with +1 to everything that's been said prior. I think that we'll see 3 things in 3 to 5 years. 1, I think the crypto community is going to be far more engaged in 3 years in policymaking than they are today. And I think at Coinbase, we're trying to utilize tools and ensure that the crypto community, the crypto natives, that they have the tools that they need to understand who their elected officials are, where they're voting, how they're voting, what they think about crypto, and try to amplify that so they can all engage. So I think in 3 to 5 years, the crypto community will be a major voting bloc in this country. Number 2, I think that will translate into better and more well-educated policymakers because they're going to start putting votes behind these people and get people who are actually crypto forward elected. And I think that's a really key piece. We'll also be, we'll be on the other side of another presidential where we'll see what happens in the presidential, which I also think will have more crypto overtones than we've ever seen in a presidential. And then the third and most important is I actually think in 3 to 5 years we'll have a new law. I firmly believe that Congress will be successful in passing a new law that gives us a better statutory framework. Whether or not it solves all the problems, I think that would be a very shiny object to try to go grab, but I think it could solve a lot of them. And we'll be in the United States if Congress takes this and runs with it, and then we're probably in the implementing phase in 3 to 5 years, just going very tactical on you for a second. If we go for 3 to 5 years, we'll be implementing those rules, and it will just reinforce how important it is to make sure we have policymakers and the crypto community involved.
A crypto law within 3 to 5 years?
Yeah,
Disagree?
absolutely.
Yes,
On the books?
100%.
Absolutely.
Wow. All right, so I've heard we need new rules for new tools. I heard strap in, it'll be bumpy, but overall, a lot of optimism, and I heard that the crypto community needs to get more involved in the policy part of things. Really good stuff. Can we give these three a big round of applause? Really appreciate it. Oh, cool. Good.